Hello everyone and welcome to the historynetwork.org podcast. I will update on new patrons and updated patronages that have happened in a couple of weeks' time when we release the next episode, as in the interest of brevity I really need to get this recorded, as it's Wednesday night at 8:30pm, and early tomorrow morning I am going with the family to see some friends of ours near Béziers in France for a long weekend. So with the baby asleep next door, it might sound like I'm whispering a bit as well, but it's just to get this episode out in time for our patrons ahead of Sunday. And I think Angus is also away at the moment, so he will be releasing this to patrons on Friday, I believe. Anyway, without further ado, the historynetwork.org podcast, season 26, episode 7, No Weapon Could Bite Him, Magic Weapons and Armour in the Middle Ages. This is going to be a double episode written by our long-time contributor, Murray Darm. Murray Darm is an ancient and medieval military historian from New Zealand living in Australia. He has written more than 100 articles on various aspects of ancient and medieval military history, as well as other historical topics from all periods, ranging from the history of opera to the runic alphabet and recipients of the Victoria Cross. He is the author of Combat 40, Macedonian Phalangite versus Persian Warrior. Alexander confronts the Achaemenids 334 to 331 BC from Osprey Publishing. He is a regular on the Ancient Warfare podcast. Magic weapons and armour are things we usually associate with the realms of myth or fantasy rather than history, and yet in semi-historical and even historical sources throughout the medieval period we find accounts of magic weapons which bring down foes or inspire comrades, or of shields and armour which protect the wearer no matter what they faced. What is more, it is clear that there is a historical reality at play in such mythological accounts, and we can see clear development of how mundane equipment came to be considered magical. The tradition of named weapons is well known. Siegfried's sword, Balmung, or Nordhung, Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, Arthur's Excalibur, or Attila's sword of Mars, and many, many others. As can be seen in these examples, we can easily transition from myth to semi-historical and into historical characters, all of whom had named weapons. Indeed, the history of named weapons dates back to antiquity, and there are literally hundreds of them across all cultures, where swords and any other weapon type you care to name were used: Scandinavian, Near Eastern, Indian, Southeast Asian, Greek and Roman, Germanic and Celtic. In a similar vein, the history of named ships is an old one, and one which continues today. In the medieval period, we have Arthur's ship, with the same name as his shield, Prydwen, meaning fair face, and the Norse god Baldur's ship, Hringodni, the greatest of all ships, and others. In the ancient world, the voyagers on the Argo, the Argonauts, led by Jason to find the Golden Fleece, had a very special ship too. The name means swift, and it was named after its builder, Argus, although the goddess Athena herself helped in its construction, including adding a piece of wood from the oracle of Zeus at Dodona, which could speak. According to Apollonius of Rhodes, the ship itself spoke to Jason, advising him to visit the witch Ciutza in order to hasten the crew's safe return home. The idea of a talking ship would seem to come from a much later age of science fiction, but there it is in ancient Greek myth. Some of the ideas behind ship names, luck and feminine identities especially, can also be found in the Middle Ages, and they remain in place. Some named weapon traditions do indeed come from a later period. Julius Caesar's sword, called Croesus, Yellow Death, comes from Geoffrey of Monmouth in the 12th century, and not earlier. According to Geoffrey, it was acquired by the British Prince Nennius in single combat with Caesar. Elsewhere, in the Welsh annals, it is called Red Death or Grey Death, the magic sword, killed if it inflicted even the smallest wound. A word should be said here about my use of the word magic, as I am using it to refer to weapons across a range of times, cultures and religious beliefs. Here, magic should simply be understood as a weapon, shield or armour which was considered to possess special qualities outside of the norm of a weapon or piece of equipment of that type. Of course, we have archaeological finds of actual inscribed words, scabbards and spearheads too, from the 3rd to the 11th centuries at least. Some of these finds are of the names of the man who made the blade, such as the numerous Ulfbert swords. This is still an important tradition in the vein of figures like Wayland and Smith. Other blades seem to have owners' names inscribed. There are makers' marks too, and magical stamps and inscriptions, such as a boar stamp or the complete runic futhark. But there are also named weapons. Many of these inscriptions are unclear and their interpretation debated. The names are intriguing in themselves. Famous one, increased to pain. Others suggest elements like test, assailant, harm, or speed, rushing, whirring. Weapon names were a very personal thing, and it should be no surprise that their interpretation is difficult, but these actual examples bear out that weapon naming was not just a literary or a mythological tradition. It should also be noted that swords were most commonly named on the tang of the blade, where the name could be seen in combat. Runes and symbols were more commonly inscribed on the hilt, guard or pommel, or scabbard, although there are hilt inscriptions too. We of course have several inscribed weapons, as well as shields and armour, dedicated as offerings to the gods across several cultures. More mundane, but still part of this tradition, are named sling bullets, with inscriptions akin to "Take that," although many are far ruder, such as the Latin phrases Fulviae Landicam Paeto and Paeto Octaviani Culum. These would have had the message made into the mould, although others would simply have the name of the legion from which they came stamped into them, presumably so enemies would know who had hurt them. Others were made with a trident or thunderbolt depicted as part of the mould. Soldiers in World War I, World War II, and today, writing messages in chalk on aircraft bomb loads, are directly connected with this tradition, as is possibly the apocryphal story of the origin of the fingers from the Battle of Agincourt. The French made it known that they would cut off the index and middle finger of any English archer they caught. When the English were surprisingly victorious, the archers showed, with the famous gesture, that they still had their fingers intact. In the Mabinogion story, how Culhwch von Olwen, King Arthur, names more than just his sword. My sword Caledwch, my spear Rongaminiad, my shield Wyneguthacher, my knife Carnwenen. Layman's Brute names Arthur's helmet, which had been his father Uther's, as Goswit. Arthur's shield is possibly the first named magic armour in his tradition, named before any weapon of his is introduced. The Annales Cambriae names the shield at the Battle of Badon in the year 516. Although this involves the confusion of the Welsh for shoulders to be understood for shield, Arthur carried the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ for 3 days and 3 nights on his shield, literary shoulders. The author Nennius records that the shield depicting the Virgin Mary was carried at the Battle of Gunnion Fort, not Badon Hill. A folk tale from the Isle of Man tells of Culan manufacturing a sword, spear, and shield for Concobar, future king of Ulster. Concobar had consulted the oracle at Clocher and was told to go to Man to have the weapons made. The story also tells of a mermaid captured by Concobar, who told him to have her image and name, Tival, the princess of the ocean, inscribed on the shield. She promised that if he looked upon the image before battle and invoked her name, the strength of his enemies would diminish, while his and his companions would increase proportionately. The shield was made in this way, and Concobar thereafter saw nothing but success. The idea of a shield blazon having special powers goes back to ancient Greece, at least, with evil eye and Medusa designs intended to thwart enemies, and inspirational or fear-inspiring shield designs continued in the Roman and then into the medieval period. Magic weapons could also inspire men around them. We need look no further than the discovery of the Holy Lance, which had pierced Christ's side in Antioch on June the 14th, 1098, and the effect it had on the hard-pressed crusaders in the city. Their spirits revived at once. When the army went to battle before the walls, the lance went with them, carried by the Bishop of Le Puy, and they were victorious. Raymond of Aguilera's account is even more inspired than the anonymous author of the Gesta. Raymond was one of the men sent to find the lance. I, Raymond, author of this book, kissed the point of the lance as it barely protruded from the ground. I cannot relate the happiness and rejoicing which filled Antioch. The magic protection the lance offered during the battle is recounted by Raymond. Superior in numbers, they neither wounded anyone nor shot arrows against us. No doubt, because of the protection of the Holy Lance, I was both a witness to these events and bearer of the Holy Lance. Anna Komnena names it as the Holy Nail, since the relic of the Holy Lance was supposed to be in Constantinople already. We might be sceptical of the discovery of such a relic, although belief in relics persists to this day. But what was important for the Crusaders was their belief that they had found the lance and the inspiration it produced. A similar idea of inspiration can be seen in the military standards of medieval armies, several of which were considered magical, whether they bore the cross or the oriflamme or the raven. This in many ways reflected the importance of military standards reaching back into the Roman period. King Arthur's Draco standard was probably based on a Roman cavalry pennant, and the Parthian standard was also a serpent. One author recorded by Lucian, How to Write History 29, claimed that the Parthians had real giant serpents in their armies which would swallow and crush their enemies, revealing the fear and awe such standards could inspire. The Annals of St. Neots records that the Viking raven standard would flap its wings in victory or droop motionless in defeat. Several groups used a raven banner under several names, and other accounts suggested that it had been made so cleverly that it looked like the raven was flying as the banner fluttered in the breeze. It is also mentioned in several entries in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, several annals, and Asser's Life of Alfred, under the same year of 878, although this passage is considered to have been added by the Archbishop Matthew Parker to Asser's life from other accounts, most probably the Annals of St. Neots, in his edition published in 1574. King Canute used a raven banner at the Battle of Ashington in 1016, and according to the Encomium Emme Reginae it was a banner which gave a wonderful omen. I am well aware that this may seem incredible to the reader, but nevertheless I insert it in my veracious work because it is true. This banner was woven of the cleanest and whitest silk, and no picture of any figures was found on it. In case of war, however, a raven was always to be seen, as if it were woven into it. If the Danes were going to win the battle, the raven appeared beak wide open, flapping its wings and restless on its feet. If they were going to be defeated, the raven did not stir at all, and all its limbs hung motionless. Other magical banners existed as well. William the Conqueror is said to have had the banner of the Apostle Peter from the Pope in the Gesta Willemi Ducis Normanorum et Regis Anglorum, although another tradition states that he sent his banner sumptuously embroidered with gold and precious stones in the form of a man fighting to the Pope after his success. The oriflamme battle standard of Charlemagne and later medieval French kings was also considered the banner of St. Peter, although it came from the monastery of Saint Denis. The red colour of the oriflamme supposedly came from it having been dipped in the blood of the decapitated Saint Denis. When the oriflamme was unfurled in battle, it showed that the French intended to take no prisoners, as at the battles of Crécy, Poitiers and Agincourt the last time it was flown, and by this fact to intimidate enemies. The oriflamme was first used by a French king in 1124 and carried on several campaigns. It was taken to the disastrous Seventh Crusade by Louis IX, where it was lost in Egypt to the Ayyubid Sultan. The oriflamme was in fact lost 5 times during its military career, but maintained its meaning and significance. Indeed, it seems as if the oriflamme was replaced several times, as descriptions and images of it change over the centuries. After Agincourt in 1415, the French adopted a different battle flag, with a significance all its own, the fleur-de-lis on a white ground of Joan of Arc. The royal banner of the French kings, gold fleur-de-lis on an azure ground, also had military significance, since the azure ground was meant to have come from the cloak of Saint Martin of Tours, patron saint of soldiers. According to legend, Martin cut his cloak in 2 and gave one half to clothe a beggar. Martin's half became important to the Merovingian dynasty, 5th to 8th centuries, their successors, the Carolingian dynasty, 8th to 12th centuries, and then as the standard of the kings of the Kingdom of France from the 12th century onwards. It remained a relic in its own right, used for the swearing of oaths. Other banners could also bear fear-inspiring names. In the saga of Harold Hardrada, King Harold had a much-feared banner called the Land Ravager or Land Waster. We have several accounts of magic armour from antiquity onwards, such as that made for Achilles by the god Hephaestus, god of the forge. It had a magical property that it could not be pierced. Several sets of armour made for individuals, like the armour made for Beowulf by Wayland and Smith, are not given any specific magical properties. Their magic lies in their undoubted quality, assured by the smith who made them. Others have a quality implied in who their owner was, the shield of El Cid or his 2 named swords, Tizona and Collada, for instance. The Holy Roman Emperor Charlemagne had a sword named Joyeuse, joyous according to the Song of Roland, and some connect it with the sword of Attila. Charlemagne's commanders also had named swords. Roland had Durendal, connected to Hector of Troy, and Wayland the smith and Ogier the Dane wielded a blade called cortana or curtana. Ogier's sword was reputed to be the sword of Tristan, and it may be the English coronation sword, curtana, the sword of mercy, used to this day. The French coronation sword remained joyeuse from the 13th to 18th century, although another, known as Charlemagne's sword, exists in Vienna. Now you might argue that most of these examples are mythological and therefore not strictly historical, although several are, but several vital aspects of military culture survive in mythology, and the historical record is revealed via these examples. The idea of stripping a defeated foe of his weapons and armour was not only a way of obtaining wealth. This practice was present throughout medieval warfare, but has its roots in Greek heroic warfare, as described in the Iliad 1,000 years, if not more, earlier. Looting corpses or trophy hunting continued, and continues, in warfare, although more for memento or material gain than a way of absorbing renown. To have taken the sword, armour or shield of a prominent warrior would enhance your reputation on the battlefield, something the poet expresses in the Battle of Maldon, lines 159 to 161. The qualities assumed to belong to those items came from the items themselves, but also whose they had been, and having them suggested how skilled the present owner needed to be in order to have got them. This can also be seen in part in cultures where a victorious warrior absorbed the skills of his defeated opponent. We can see this when Hector aims to get the armour of Achilles, unbeknownst to him, worn by Patroclus in the Iliad. This armour too was impenetrable, which is why Achilles had allowed Patroclus to wear it, and Hector, having stripped Patroclus, killed him and then put Achilles' own armour on, as a way of showing to all his prowess and accomplishment, as well as upgrading to a better set of armour. Hector could only be slain through a gap in the armour, a fact which Achilles knew and exploited when he took revenge and killed Hector. Arriving at Troy, Achilles had enchanted armour, spear and horses, although the literary record of these gifts is a complex one. There are some magical armour traditions which span cultures and time. In the Nibelungenlied, Siegfried obtains a cloak which renders him invisible. In Greek mythology, Hades had a helmet which made him invisible, made for him by the Cyclops. This helmet was worn by various figures, including Athena, Hermes and Perseus, who was given them by Athena in some versions of the Perseus-Gorgon myth. Another invisibility cloak is attributed to Arthur, the so-called Mantle of Arthur in Cornwall, one of the 13 treasures of the island of Britain, a Welsh text from the 15th century. Again, we might pour scorn on this idea as mythology, or Harry Potter, but in the ancient world, for instance, the power of Alexander the Great's cloak was considered real. Pompey the Great wore it in his triumph almost 300 years later. The cloak-like aegis of Zeus is another powerful mantle, and we have seen the royal standard of the French kings was made from the cloak of Saint-Martin. We also need to consider the power of such stories associated with cloaks and other items. We may laugh at them, or at those who believe them, but belief in stories of the Grail, or the clear inspiring power of the discovery of the Holy Lance at Antioch, for instance, were decidedly real. Fear of the magical qualities of the Viking berserker were also very real. And the stories of heroes' accoutrements, whether they be Beowulf, El Cid, or Roland, inspired generations. Weapons also took on power in both myth and history based on their deeds, who they had killed and fought with, or what they meant. The sword in the stone and the sword in the tree of the Volsung saga are clear examples. In the next episode, we're going to be carrying on with looking at magical weapons, starting with King Arthur and his knights. Thanks so much for listening. You've been listening to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast, written by Murray Darm, read by Nick Barker.